I wanted to just briefly introduce the topic today that we're talking about of organizing to build for power, right? How you can prepare for a strike in your contract campaign. We've got a number of speakers here today to talk about it. So just the format, I'll give a little introduction, and the format, everyone will have about 10 to 15 minutes, the presenters to speak, and then we're going to have the rest of the time used to have a broader discussion with the group so that we can get into, hear all of your voices and hear what's going on and how we can think through how we build for power in our unions. So a fundamental part of a vibrant and democratic union culture is to be able to involve members in contract negotiations, building a base to take action and having since the beginning of a fighting campaign. We know that major wins and victories are never won at the table alone. Most of the time, they're the result of members' mobilizations and through shifting of the existing relation of forces between management, and especially through the use of the strike. So in order to win the kind of things that we need, cost of living increases, more protections for women, immigrants, and other sectors, and to defeat the attacks on healthcare and pensions, any union needs to prepare for real fighting, and including sort of how we can think about building for a strike and what that looks like. When contract campaigns are organized in a democratic manner and from a strong refusal to take concessions, usually members get involved and are transformed through this experience. So that's kind of the broad picture of what we're going to be looking at today. And we've got speakers here, Garrett Sishidu Strain from UAW 2865 at UC Berkeley. Myself, I already introduced myself. Ann Robertson from CFA, San Francisco State. That's you, I thought that was you, okay, good. And Joel Jordan, co-coordinator of California Alliance for Community Schools, retired LUSD teacher, and former UTLA director of special projects. So maybe we'll start off with Garrett and kind of go our way through for the presenters, and we're gonna kind of do a little combo and probably have a shorter amount of time so we can, I think yours was a little longer, so, and then we'll get to discussion. So thanks again for being here, and Garrett, you want to get us started off?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Paul, for having me and for helping organize this conference. So I'm going to talk about how just the mechanics of how to prepare for a strike, and I'm going to draw on some of my own experiences as an organizer with United Auto Workers and other unions, and I'm going to try to keep this interactive. So I'm going to pose a couple of questions to the group as we go along about how you can assess whether you're strike ready. And we can talk through that together. So I guess the first question when you're thinking about building for a strike, right, is kind of the first question you really need to ask yourself is what kind of strike are you building towards, right? Because there are many varieties of strikes in terms of like what U.S. unions are doing today. One type of strike is a one-day strike where a minority of workers in the workplace participate, but there's a lot of fanfare, a lot of community involvement, a lot of publicity. Can anyone kind of think of recent examples of a one-day strike where a minority of the workers walked off the job? Any recent examples of that?
I'm not sure, but was the undergraduate workers cafe strike one?
Yeah, I don't know what their participation rate was.
It looked pretty good. But.
Yeah. I mean, one example might be that folks have heard about the recent fast food strikes that are happening right now, right? I mean, they're really exciting, and there's been gains that have been made as a result of the strikes, but they are, for the most part, minority participation strikes where a minority of the workers in each store participate, and they're one-day strikes, right? So they're not open-ended. Other examples might include the recent Walmart strikes that have happened, where Walmart workers have walked off the job, but in most cases it's a small minority of Walmart workers in any given store, and the strike only lasts for a day or so. And it's not to say that these strikes can't accomplish something, right? There have been gains that have been accomplished as a result of these strikes. Walmart raised wages up to, I believe, $11 an hour nationwide as a result of these strikes, right? But there's another category of strike out there that a union can do that is able to win even more than a minority participation strike. Can anyone guess what category of strike that might be?
Open-ended.
Open-ended, yeah, that's one aspect of it. So what does it mean to have an open-ended strike?
Don't go back until you won.
Exactly. So this isn't a one-day publicity event. We're going to stay out until we win a contract that our members find satisfactory. So you can think of the recent Seattle Teachers Union strike. 2 years ago, that was an open-ended strike. Or the 2012 Chicago Teachers Union strike, also open-ended. What about in terms of participation? We talked before about minority strikes, minority participation strikes. What's the opposite of minority participation? Yeah, so
I'm gonna guess.
Yeah. So it's a majority participation strike. What I'm going to talk about today is we want to set our sights high, right? We want to win as much as possible in this environment of attacks on workers and attacks on immigrants and attack on the working class. We want to win as much as possible, which means we want to set our sights high, right? We want to set our sights to hold a majority participation open-ended strike where we win big. So how do you get there? How do you do a majority participation strike? Actually, real quick, I want to just throw this out to the crowd before I move on. Why is a majority participation strike preferable to a minority participation strike? Let's talk through the mechanics of that. Yeah.
Greatest impact.
What is the impact?
The impact is affecting the organization that you're striking against.
Totally, and affecting it economically, right? I'll just give you a little example from the University of California. I'm part of the Graduate Students Union, and we're right now about to enter our contract campaign, so we're talking about how to build for a really powerful strike at the point where we need to be at peak power in our contract campaign. And we've done a little bit of worksite mapping, we've done mapping of our workforce, and we've discovered that about 1/4 of all the classes at Berkeley are taught in one department, and that's the electrical engineering and computer science department, right? It's a very difficult department to organize in. People for the most part, are not already politicized. For the most part, they haven't been involved in any kind of social justice struggle before. But if we were to merely hold a strike with those folks in our unit, like in sociology, my department, or in anthropology, other departments where folks are more politicized, and we were to ignore that department, that where 1/4 of the teaching happens, what would the consequence of that be? Right, we wouldn't be able to win as much as we could otherwise if we had organized those folks to go on strike with us. So you need to be thinking really carefully about how to maximize your impact on the employer, because ultimately, if you maximize your impact on the employer, you're going to win big. So how do you build for a majority participation strike? A lot of organizers, the way that they think about this, the way that we think about this is starting from the end point. Right? So imagine yourself, you're around a table of other leaders in your union the night before you're about to go on strike, and you're assessing your power as a union to hold a majority participation strike. What levels of power do you want to have that night before? What kind of measurable levels of power do you want to make sure you have at that meeting the night before, when you're assessing your power?
People?
Yeah, so how many people do you want to be involved in your union?
95%, like the Chicago Teachers Union.
Yeah, and 95%, so what do we mean by involved, right? 95%.
Striking acts, strike petition, signs, strike petitions.
Yeah, you want to get 95% to strike, right? But this is the night before. You're getting together. How can you be reasonably certain that 95% of people in your workforce will strike?
You'd have to do a survey and get people to commit, to say on the phone or to sign something, I'm going to go out and strike.
Totally. So a strike pledge, right? So if you have the night before, you're getting together, you say, okay, we've had 75% of people in our union sign a pledge to strike. That's a good sign, right? That's a sign that you're probably in a pretty good position to have a majority participation strike. What about in terms of membership, right? A lot of our unions, you have both members and non-members in the union. What level of membership do you want to make sure you have on the eve of a strike?
As high as possible.
As high as possible, right? in
But
order to
you
plan,
want-
yeah, go ahead.
You want to have like 80, 90%.
80, 90%. And that's because would we really expect someone who's not a member of the union to go on strike? If someone who's not been involved in shaping the bargaining priorities, someone who hasn't participated in a strike authorization vote, someone who hasn't been involved in the union at all, do we really expect them to go on strike the next day? Probably not, right? So these are the hard questions you have to ask yourself when you're preparing for a strike. At minimum, you're probably going to want to have 70, 80, 90% of your union as members of the union. That's like the baseline, right? What are some other kind of concrete metrics to determine whether you're ready for a strike?
Cash flow? I mean, is like having a budget to like deal with issues that come up for members if they're not getting paid or something like that, right?
Totally, yeah. You want to have a strike fund that is ready to go because you want to be able to economically support your members when they're out on strike. Cool, yeah. So I think these. And what about in terms of just the level of reps in your union, like stewards in your union? What do you want to make sure? What level of support in terms of stewards do you want to make sure you have in your union?
I mean, 1 to 10 is usually a good figure, or you at least want to have every area that you go on strike covered, so you have a suitable number of people in a particular strike that you were talking about. The engineering students, you have a significant portion of them as well as every other unit covered.
Totally, yeah. So you want to have a good ratio of union steward to workers, so usually a ratio of like 1 to 10 is great. Our union's 16,000 people, so that's a lot of stewards for us to think about getting. But I mean, this is really important, right? Because if you assume that the week before a strike, that a worker in the electrical engineering department is going to be getting messages from management, from their supervisor. Don't strike, we'll fire you. We won't hire you the next semester. We'll dock your wages. You won't get anything in bargaining, right? What is the only thing that's going to prevent that worker? What's one of the main things that can prevent that worker from not listening from giving into management's line? It's having someone they trust in that department who can tell them, no, this is all BS, right? We can go out and strike. We can win big. And you won't lose your job if we all stand together, if we all go out together, right? So having someone in the department who workers know and trust and who they identify as being with the union is critical for being able to hold a majority participation strike. So just to sum up what we just talked about, so you want to have, on the eve of the strike, you're thinking about things you want to have at the very end of all your organizing you're doing to build for the strike. You want to have very high membership rate, 70 to 90% is usually the standard. You want to have a union, at least one union rep in every department or every unit where you have workers, preferably of a ratio of around 10 workers to 1 union rep. You want to have some kind of assessment, right, of whether the worker is going to strike, either through some kind of union strike pledge form or other form of assessment. And one other thing we didn't talk about was you want to have some measure of community support, right? Because strikes are unfortunately all too rare in this day and age, and the strikes that are really successful are strikes where there's a strong community support. You think about the Chicago Teachers Union, where on the eve of the strike, the teachers union was more popular in the city than Rahm Emanuel, right? Than the mayor. That's a very that's a really good measure. Like, okay, you've built up a lot of community support among teachers, among parents, among students to do your strike. Any questions about any of those kind of ways of measuring your power? I really think it's important that folks take this super seriously when they're preparing for a strike, because if we're sloppy about assessing our power and we just assume that the kind of moral force of the strike will be enough to make workers go out and strike the next day, we're likely to be sorely disappointed, right? We have to really think carefully and hard about building for the strike and concretely assessing our power. So I'm going to throw it up to Paul. Paul's going to talk a little bit about how we get to that end point that we just talked about.
And so, yeah, and I also want to put this in a context of actually a failed opportunity, right? And so I want to actually talk a little bit about sort of my role working with the librarians here at UC Berkeley. We just had a reopener campaign, which basically means it was in the middle of a current contract that we were going over certain articles of the contract, and we were developing a campaign around that. So I kind of want to give this example because I think it's important to think about how not to do certain things, and then how by sort of encouraging more democratic practices within our unions, we can actually build up sort of the opportunities for people to get more involved and help towards winning the kind of things that we need through the contract campaign. So. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about, basically, we were working on this sort of reopener campaign. I got hired on as the staff person in the middle of this kind of campaign, and I was really surprised to see that there wasn't an organizing committee, that people weren't doing too many actions. People were doing sort of having some conversations, doing some sort of petition kind of sporadically across the department, but there were a lot of things that I saw that were missing, right? So what I want to talk through is basically how do we get there, and within the context of this sort of campaign. So first off, we want to have a representative organizing committee, right? Has everyone heard that term before, an organizing committee? Right? Does someone want to just sum that up, what that is?
It's having someone from every department, if they're in different departments, and representatives of all the people who work in the institution.
Exactly.
So you just want to have a cross-section.
That's right. That's right. You want to have
maybe want to even emphasize certain aspects, like having recruiting women to be in, depending on the workplace.
Right. You want to
or minorities to be in the.
You want a diverse kind of representative body of the workforce, right? You want organic leaders in your organizing committee, right? Who are the people who naturally know, you know what I mean, the people you go to when you have an issue, right? Or the people who throw the best parties, or right, the people that are sort of leaders in their work sites, right? So what I found when I jumped into this campaign was there was no organizing committee, but rather there was a bargaining team that was sort of more from the top of the statewide, because this is a sort of across the state of California through all the UCs. There's about 350 librarians throughout the UCs. Here at Berkeley, there's about 80. So what happened? We get here and people are kind of being told from the top, here's the campaign, this is what we're doing, we're going to collect some signatures to present to this person, this manager, right? So every campus was kind of doing their own thing at all sorts of different levels of participation, right? So one of the things we saw really early on was that there wasn't sort of a strong level of participation across all the campuses, or activity of kind of like what Garrett was talking about. So what I tried to do was just to change the idea that we just have a bargaining committee that are the people that sort of work at the table, right? And actually have folks who are working across all the different libraries at UC Berkeley who could then inform what's going on at bargaining, right? Because a good sort of preparation would be the bargaining team is in close contact with an organizing committee, right? So that they know where our power is, where our level of participation is, to know what they can actually talk about at the table, right? And that we can sort of influence each other both on the ground and at the bargaining table, right? So what I did was basically, there was no sort of idea of an organizing committee. So I just, I'm saying, this is the bargaining committee, right? And I worked across going through all the different libraries. People got really excited because they started getting more involved, right? And we had a plan to escalate, right? And I kept calling it a bargaining committee. Come to the bargaining committee. We had like 5 people, 10 people start showing up, 15, to a core group of around 15 to 20 people on this bargaining committee. And then I start saying bargaining organizing committee. So I just start introducing the idea of what we're actually trying to do is not just bargain, right? But we want to be in constant contact with our members. We want to be having them be involved in the process, right? So we were able to set up this organizing committee. We had a strong plan, because this is another point I think that's really important, is we want to be able to build up the confidence of workers to take action, right? Because I think so often in this sort of neoliberal capitalist system, right, we're told to be individuals. And in academia, it's very, I think this is kind of even more reinforced, where you have to be the best academic, or you have to be, all these ways that we're getting atomized as workers, right? So there's a lot to combat and ways in which how can we start thinking collectively and working together. So this is a way that we can do sort of small actions that lead up to bigger ones, right? And I think you're going to talk a little bit more about structure tests. So I'll just kind of wrap this up. So what we did was, we're trying to talk about power early on, right? So we had this very simple, it was called a commitment card, or a count on me card, right? You can count on me to support the bargaining efforts by, I will talk to my coworkers, I will show up to union meetings, I will go to a rally, and the last one is I will go on strike, right? And it's there, so what happens? We have a conversation with a worker who's never been talked to before. In that first conversation, right, and like I said, this was the middle of a campaign. It should really happen in the beginning of a campaign. In the first conversation, we talk about all the things that we can do as workers, right? And the last thing is a strike. So then it allows us to talk about power, right? A lot of people said, oh, but we can't strike, right? Because we have a no strike clause. Yes, we have a no strike clause, but we can talk about sort of different types of collective actions, right? We can talk about what happens after the contract expires so that we can go on strike, right? So it's an opportunity to both educate folks about their own sort of power, raise political consciousness, and get strong commitments from the workers on the ground of what they're willing to do, right? And then we follow up. They said they'll help out with a petition. The next thing that we're doing is we're doing a statewide petition to all the university librarians across the state, right? We were then saying, in order to do this, we want to get, 70% of our workers signed up on this, and then we do that, we do all this outreach, we reach for support of communities, right? So we're asking students, we're asking lecturers, we're asking grad students, all the campus workers to sign on to this petition, right? And then we have a plan to sort of escalate beyond that, of actually presenting that and having a group of our leaders be able to go. And like I said, when I'm saying leaders, I'm talking about organic leaders, right? So these are rank and file workers mostly in this case, right? But who are able to get sort of active through the process of creating more opportunities for them to engage in their union, right? I think one of the problems we see with a lot of top-down or bureaucratic unions is that there aren't these types of opportunities to get involved, so what happens? Right? People get disengaged, they're apathetic, right? They don't see that they can actually do something, right? So when we open up these opportunities, and what I was being told by across the state is like, oh, the librarians don't want to do anything, they're not active, they don't want to go on strike, they don't want to do anything. Once you have a plan and you make it democratic so that workers can actually come up with the policy, the actions and the plans collectively together, people do want to get engaged, right? So I'll just wrap up really quickly by saying this is where we failed in the sense, right? Because what happened was we were doing all of this here at Berkeley, and some of the other campuses, Santa Cruz was really strong as well, Davis was really strong, but some of the other ones were, not as strong. They were being told, that they couldn't, like I said, that they don't do anything, right? And there's a history there that I don't know about. I'm not working at those sites, so I don't know what that looks like. But what happened was we were building for actions with this petition. We had a plan to escalate to do a sort of an informational picket where we can kind of start doing some more bigger collective actions, right? So what happens is when we're ready to escalate on one of the bargaining calls, our representative from Berkeley unfortunately wasn't able to make it to this meeting, right? And so that was also the meeting where a decision was made to just settle the contract. And this was really tough because what happened was it was a 1.5% salary increase, which is actually what all the other unrepresented workers got. So then there was a lot of disillusionment, right? Because they settled with that, and and I think a lot of the folks here at Berkeley, but across the state were kind of hoping for more, but didn't see that there was actually a plan to win, right? So this is more of an opportunity to think about how can we encourage moving forward how can we encourage the folks that we work with to actually be involved in this process, to have a plan that moves forward to build for a strike that we can actually win the kind of things we need. We saw that when we don't build for these big actions, we lose, right? Like at the end of the day, we couldn't do it. So now I'll kind of actually wrap up now because I think our time is a little short, but maybe I can talk a little bit more in the discussion section about other things. But did you have some final thoughts? I'm actually realizing we're running a little out of time.
I mean, just to introduce one concept, which you briefly mentioned, is the idea of a structure test. All of the things that Paul mentioned, petitions, pledge cards, these are all what organizers call structure tests, which essentially means a way for you as an organizer to assess how ready workers are to take higher forms of action, more militant forms of action. And during a contract campaign, basically the most intense structure test that you can do is the strike authorization vote. How many of you are y'all part of unions that have had a strike authorization vote? Okay, cool. What was the participation rate like for those votes? What percent of workers participated?
84%.
84%, dang,
Yeah,
that's good.
that's what they say.
Yeah.
Are you asking how many actually voted or how many
Yeah, how many voted?
How many voted? Not the, so yeah, this is a crucial distinction because you'll oftentimes hear unions say that 99% of our workers voted to authorize a strike, but it'd be 99% of the 40% that voted or something, right? So I'm asking what percent of the workers you represent voted in the strike authorization vote? So we heard 80%?
Yeah, I think it was 84.
84, okay. Yeah.
We're 32%.
32%, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, these are really important structure tests because, again, if a worker does not vote yes in a strike authorization vote, how likely do we think it is that they're actually going to go on strike? Probably very unlikely, right?
And often the easiest way to not have to vote no is just to not vote at all, which
Yeah.
is where you get your
Exactly. Exactly. So just to give you a kind of example of a really amazing passing with flying colors example of a structure test is the Chicago Teachers Union. They recently held a strike authorization vote where after 3 days of voting, 678,000 of the members' 24,000 eligible members cast ballots, which was a 96.05%. No, 88% of the total members voted, and then 96% of those 88% voted yes. Now that is just amazing, right? So 88% of people voted in the strike vote. So that's a really fabulous kind of test to know that you really have power going into your decision to strike.
Okay, good. So we'll turn it over to Ann Robertson to talk a little bit about what was going on at CFA, and then Joel will come in afterwards.
Okay, and I'm going to try to keep it to 10 minutes. So,
Okay, great.
Paul, could you give me a signal at 5 minutes, 3
Yes.
minutes, and 1?
5, 3, and 1.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, so I teach at San Francisco State. Our union is the California Faculty Association. So I want to describe how it operates so that you know what not to do. And I want to contrast that with the Chicago Teachers Union, which does do a fabulous job. But I want to conclude with one little criticism of the Chicago Teachers Union and just mention what happened with the Teamsters back in the 90s as a kind of a contrast. But let me just begin by mentioning that back in the 1980s, the top labor officials began to say the strike is obsolete. And so they were promoting this partnership with the bosses, as it were, and in addition to electing Democrats to office. And we've seen the results of that strategy. Our standard of living has continually dropped since then. So the strike is, of course, our most important weapon. In any case, so the California Faculty Association is spread over the 23 campus CSU system. And we're a part of SEIU. So, so here at San Francisco State, we have about 1,000 members. And again, this is not what you want to do. We have an e-board that has, I think, 12 positions. It could have many more, but people aren't interested in being on it. So we have about 6 or 8 people at each meeting. And we never post our minutes. so nobody knows what we do. We pass resolutions occasionally, but we don't tell our membership about them, and so they don't know about it. So they know virtually nothing of what we do. We have membership meetings twice a year, where we call on the full membership to come. So we have 1,000 members, roughly, and out of that 1,000 members, 20, 25 people come to the membership meetings. So it's a horrible turnout. At these meetings, a statewide officer, so we're just San Francisco State, but somebody from the statewide leadership comes to our campus, and they talk to us for about 45 minutes, and they have a PowerPoint presentation, and then we're invited to ask questions. So we don't make any decisions, they don't ask for our input, and usually the same people don't come back a second time to these meetings. So we get a new, fresh 20 to 25 people at the next meeting. In any case, and then we don't give any reports to our members about what happened at this membership meeting. So the other 99%, they don't know anything about what happened. So, but usually nothing happens, so that's not a big loss. But in any case, despite all of this, this past fall, our membership voted to strike because we have been so abused financially with respect to our salaries in the CSU system. So people voted to strike, and 84% turnout. I assume that is the correct number. I was a little bit surprised at that. Usually I ask them, how many people voted when we have a vote? And they say, we won't tell you. They refuse to tell because, of course, it reveals their weakness, and so they won't tell us. In any case, so here people voted to strike. So we had to start organizing picket lines. Well, we couldn't get enough people to volunteer to be on a picket line to close down the campus. Fortunately for us, our union and the CSU came to a tentative agreement, saving us from the horrible debacle of having a miserably staffed picket line. And so we came out with a tentative agreement that people eventually voted on. Let's see. In fact, I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So in any case, our union statewide has 2 major assemblies a year, and these are the big decision-making bodies. But the assemblies are organized so that most of what happens is like a dog and pony show. People come in and talk to you, experts come in and talk to you, a Democratic Party member comes in and gives a keynote speech. And so that the amount of time that's left for the members to actually give their input into how to run what decisions should be made becomes minuscule. Like the last time I went, it was like the last half of the day. And so it was just, and then the speaker said, we're going to have to cut each speaker down to 1 minute, because otherwise we won't have enough time for enough. In any case, so decisions as a result are seldom made at these meetings. Now, back in 2010, I did take in a resolution to tax the rich in order to, it's 5 minutes,
Yeah.
Thank you. No questions yet. Thanks. I took a resolution to tax the rich. It did get passed. They forgot to post it on our website. And when it came to supporting the millionaire's tax, which the California Federation of Teachers initiated, my union refused to support it. So that's a whole other story. In any case, okay, the last thing to say about this statewide thing, and I just want to then go on to the Chicago Teachers Union, is that at our last meeting where our statewide president came in, she said, we could never get a dues increase if the membership voted on it. And that just shows you the contempt. It's the mindset of contempt for the membership. As if, see, they never tell us how they spend the money. So of course people wouldn't want to vote to increase something that you don't know. Therefore, there's no accountability, there's no transparency. But if they laid out how the money was being spent, and it was being spent in a good way, then of course people would vote for a dues increase. But the whole mindset is, don't trust the members to make decisions, and we'll just have to make we won't tell them what we're doing. And so that's their strategy. Many unions, I think, operate this way. Okay, so in any case, last thing is, when we got a tentative agreement last fall, the union came in and lied about it. They lied about it to get it passed. And I won't go into the details, but I've seen that happen before in other unions, where they just lie to the membership about what they got. In any case, so in contrast, you've got the Chicago Teachers Union. They started off with issue committees where people could volunteer for an issue committee, and that issue committee was the committee that generated the demand that they took into negotiations. So the membership had a big role right from the beginning. They were making important decisions. They educated their members. They instilled their members with the sense that they could win. They were constantly transmitting information to their members, but also soliciting feedback from the members, so that they were constantly adjusting their approach according to the desires of the members. They, of course, made big alliances with the community. When they were involved in negotiations, they informed their members every step of the way of exactly what was going on. In my union, when we were involved, they would send out announcements like, we made an offer, they made a counter offer, and then we discussed it. You know, as if they were saying something, giving us some content. So then they continued their strike in 2012, 2 extra days, so that the delegates could go to the members, get their feedback on this tentative agreement, and then they voted to accept it. In any case, so in all of that, you've got a big sense of solidarity. And when the members have the voice informing decisions, when they discuss and debate the issues, in that process, you begin to get a sense of community, you begin to trust one another, you begin to rely on one another, and you two were mentioning that it's this whole new dynamic, a whole new culture begins to take hold of the union, and you can do a whole lot with that. Now, just one minute, really quickly. The Chicago Teachers Union, in my opinion, they made one mistake, and that was to support a Democrat for mayor against Rahm Emanuel. Of course, you'd think anybody's better than Rahm Emanuel. But the Democrat, like a Democrat does, came out with things like, Rahm Emanuel closed 50 schools and angered the whole community. This candidate was only going to reopen a few of them. Then, he said, Emanuel cut the teachers' pensions. This candidate said, well, I won't cut them until we have a dialogue. So, geez. So that was a huge waste. So, and they poured in a lot of money and effort to this guy, and he lost, undeservedly so. That might be going too far. In any case, but just to contrast that with the Teamsters Union, I might take a minute or two extra.
Yeah, sure.
Is that in 1994, the Teamsters had a contract with UPS, and UPS unilaterally broke the contract and said, we're going to lift the limit on how much we require you to lift to 150 pounds from 70 pounds. And Ron Carey was head of the Teamsters then. He said, well, let's talk about this. Because they had already agreed on 70. It was in the contract. So they said, UPS said, no, we're not going to talk about it. We're just going to do it. And so at that point, Robert Reich stepped in and he said, I'm prepared to mediate. And Ron Carey said, no, thanks, we'll take care of it. So he had just immediately called the workers on strike. The UPS went out and got a court injunction against them. And Carey ignored the court injunction. They kept on with the strike, and within 24 hours, UPS capitulated. So that you rely on your members, not the politicians. Let me just go one more step, and that is, in 1997, Ron Carey went on to win this incredible strike against UPS. They promoted the part-timers first and foremost, but they won big gains for everybody. Immediately afterwards, the Clinton administration accused Carey of financial improprieties. They removed him from office. They told him he could never run for office again. They put him on trial for financial irregularities, and he was judged innocent, and they never rescinded his restrictions from running for office again. So the whole issue was, his real crime, of course, was he won this incredible strike, so the whole moral is, you don't count on the courts, you don't count on the Democrats, you don't count on the politicians, but you count on your membership. That's your strongest base. And when you build up that fighting community of spirit, where you're all trusting one another, relying on one another, and fighting together, you begin to inspire everybody, and workers all over the map. And you can make big changes in that direction. And that, again, just going along with what you two said. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, so our next panelist is Joel Jordan. So why don't you take it away?
So I'm going to talk about a unique statewide effort that involves getting out of what I would call the bargaining box that K through 12 or really early childhood ed through adult ed locals in California face increasingly. And an effort that is a work in progress, has some problems I'll talk about, and but I think is very much worth getting behind and certainly knowing about, because most people don't know about it. Just to start, to set the context, if you look at collective bargaining for these locals in California, 90% of the funding that comes to locals comes from the state. 10% comes from the government. Very little comes from local sources, except if there is a partial tax, which usually only wealthy districts pass. Not only wealthy districts, but it's a small amount anyways. But 90% roughly comes from the state. And what we've seen since the Great Depression of 2007-8 is that, and even with the propositions, I want to say Prop 55 that passed, that was a great proposition, and then it raised taxes on the rich, really didn't even bring these districts back to where they were before the recession. So that's one problem, that the locals, when they go into bargaining, face limitations set by the state. That's number one. I would call that the first box. The second box, which I would argue in line with what especially what Ann talked about, is what the leadership is like on the state level in the teachers' unions. If you look at the CTA, California Teachers Association, which is by far the biggest of the two, there's also the California Federation of Teachers, they prioritize inside baseball, dealing with the governor on the inside, no organizing on the outside, no organized pressure from the membership, no coordinated actions between locals in order to pressure for more funding or anything else. And that it means that the 300,000 members of CTA are limited in their strength, because their efforts, to the extent that they are involved in anything, it's usually local contract work, which, as I said, has limits in terms of what you can win. Lower class size, for instance, which is expensive, forget about it, or forget about substantial lower class size if you only rely on local negotiations. And then comes now the third box. For the last 10, 15 years, we've seen we've seen the rise of the charter school industry for the last 10, 15 years, which threatens and weakens local bargaining power by draining already scarce resources, even more so because what happens is, like in urban areas, which these charter schools are growing in most, where they're focused on and concentrated on, especially in communities, low-income communities of color, you find that, like in LA, 16% of students that would have gone to LA USD schools are going to charter schools, going to independent charter schools. 20% or so in Oakland going to charter schools, 12% in San Diego, and I could go on and on. We're seeing, and this develops a crisis, a budget crisis for these locals, because the local districts have fixed costs. They have administrative costs, teacher costs, maintenance costs, building costs, which are fixed, and then but the funding is determined by student enrollment, by ADA. So that causes a crisis. And then here again, the rules over charter schools that were set by the 1992 charter school law make it very difficult for school boards to actually turn down a charter school. The criteria that they use makes it very difficult. And even when they do, the charter schools can go to the county boards of education and the state boards of education to get approval, which they do. There have been some highly publicized cases where that has happened. Both these local entities turn them down, they go to the state and get approved. And then we come back again to the problem with the CTA, primarily the CTA leadership, which, because of its orientation, hasn't really educated the members around charter schools, hasn't really developed an organizing plan around the growth of these privately run charter schools. By the way, I just want to make clear, there are like 400 what are called affiliated dependent charter schools in California that are union, that are public, that are controlled by the districts. That these are called affiliated or dependent charter schools, but most charter schools, 3/4 to 80% of the charter schools are privately run and privately controlled, even though they're publicly funded. So what have we seen again with the CTA? They've done very little because they want to cultivate an alliance with Governor Brown, who's very pro-charter, as are a growing number of Democratic Party politicians elected with the money from the California Charter Schools Association, which is funded by the billionaires. And so the power of the charter school lobby in Sacramento and locally has been growing. So what to do about this? This represents an enormous challenge for local unions, local K-12 unions. In the fall of 2015, UTLA, which represents 32,000 members, elected a social justice organizing leadership, which decided after it had negotiated a successful contract and organized a successful contract, but still wasn't able to get anywhere near what it really wants to get in terms of fighting for the schools LA students deserve, decided that they needed to develop a statewide strategy. And what they did is they got together first with the two locals that have the most charter schools, the highest percentage of charter schools in the state, and that's Oakland, San Diego, along with UTLA. And those three locals came together to decide to try to strategize. And over the time, there were a number of other locals that came onto the table: San Francisco, Richmond, San Jose, San Bernardino, and Anaheim. Three strategic priorities came out of those discussions. The first one is that we weren't going to be able to stop the charter school train by lawsuits like was done in the state of Washington. The state of Washington had 8 charter schools at the time. The Supreme Court ruled against charter schools to put them to slow them down. Actually, they found another way to get back in the state, but they only had 8. Just to give you some idea, there are almost 1,000 charter schools in California enrolling over 450,000 students. So this train has been going on for a long time. It's developing huge momentum. Is that for 5 or 12? 10 or 12 minutes? 12. Okay, right. Yeah. And it has huge momentum. It'll take bottom-up strategy to organize against that. Second, we agreed that to address the issue of charter school expansion, you had to link it to the question of improving the public schools that exist. Especially those in low-income communities. Those are the communities that are targeted by charter schools. And why are they targeted? Because those schools have been the product of historical neglect and underfunding by the traditional public school system. This means that this coalition is part of the statewide effort to reform Prop 13, to develop a split roll property tax, which would tax commercial property, called Make It Fair, supporting the creation of community schools, which provide wraparound services and other additional services to help students. I'll pass around later on the platform of the Alliance. It's called the Alliance for Community Schools. And supports the providing resources for restorative justice programs that address the school-to-prison pipeline and more. And we believe that not only is this linking strategy necessary to win public support, but it's also necessary to mobilize our own members, because our members don't yet see, it's not just a matter of education, that certainly needs to be go on, but our members tend to be motivated around what's going on at their school, and that involves the contract. So what we wanted to do was to link contract fights around their schools with the privatization. I'll get to that in a second. So, and finally we decided that this effort that we were engaged in needed to be independent of CTA and CEFT, that it needed to be an autonomous movement that consisted of the locals involved plus community organizations, parents and students from those locals that would be involved to drive this effort. At the same time, we recognized that we were going to need at some point to push the affiliates, understanding the weaknesses and bureaucratic nature of their leaderships, to push them in a direction that further than they would be willing to go. So, but going into the summer of 2016, we still were without an organizing strategy until we realized that 5 out of the 8 locals that were at this table, including the biggest ones in the state, San Diego, UTLA, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Bernardino, that their contracts expire at the same time, July of 2017. And we thought, aha, that was an aha moment to think, yes, now what we can begin to do is create the conditions for mutual support, solidarity, and solidarity actions between these locals who are engaged in bargaining. And so we decided upon, I would say, like a 5-point strategy, which might take me a little bit longer.
We'll give you a couple more minutes.
Okay,
yeah.
all right. One was each local had to build its own kick-ass contract campaign for its local contract. But included in that contract would be not only demands around class size that maybe you couldn't win at the local level, but also demands around charter school that get toward the question of charter school expansion. So for instance, a demand that the district fund an impact study on the educational and financial impact of charter school expansion on the district. A key thing to do in order to provide the research basis for going after charter school expansion. The second was to support these demands with coordinated action statewide, because as these locals engage through their bargaining process, we would have coordinated demonstrations, petitions, all rallies and so forth at the same time in order to highlight not only the local bargaining demands, but also the state demands. And then third was to focus our energy as well on the state. That is first around bills being proposed in the legislature. This table was able to force or pressure the CTA to go much further than they have. The bills that they had sponsored in the past had only been around like stopping for-profit charter schools. Most charter schools in the state are not for-profit. They're non-profit, which isn't to say they're public. They're still private schools, but they are non-profit. So we wanted to support bills that would actually rein in charter schools in significant ways. One is to demand that, and there's a bill in the legislature on this that would say that only local districts can authorize charter schools, that it can't go to the county and the state, as I described. That would be huge. Another one is to put a moratorium on charter schools. Those bills that wouldn't have happened otherwise are now in the hopper. Now I'll get into later some of the problems with that, but that is a good thing so far. Then fourth was to expand the coalition at the state level to include parents, students, community organizations, and all this would culminate in a kind of a crisis point, thinking backwards to February of 2018. UTLA is planning on probably will strike in 2018. What we're hoping to do is through this effort, I come out of UTLA, through this effort is to expand, if not to get strike action in other locals at the same time, at least to get a lot of solidarity and support that has never existed before. When any local goes on strike, that doesn't happen in the state of California. So to make this real, for starters, we're promoting a statewide petition campaign with our platform and demands, and that's to, in light of what you guys said, to build and assess member support for this. So this is going on in all these locals, supposedly. I'll talk in a minute about some of the problems. And also to build for May 1st, and to build for a May 12th coordinated rallies at the offices of legislators demanding that they take action on these bills that are coming up in the legislature. A new round of escalations will go on in the fall of 2017, culminating in hopefully as compression point at 2018. So I want to end up by saying what I think are just the key challenges with this so far. One is, this whole thing, this whole strategy presupposes that the locals involved are organizing locals. That they or at least won't resist becoming organizing locals, where they would actually involve their membership in their own contract campaigns, leaving aside a statewide coordinated effort. Will they even mobilize around their own local contracts? And what we're finding is that, yes, many are, some of them are, but some of them, it takes a push. And that's where local caucuses come in. Caucuses and caucuses and local activists in these locals to push their locals to take action, not just around the statewide campaign, because the statewide campaign is built upon the local campaigns. If you don't have a local campaign, we can't link anything. There's nothing to link. So in order to address that, a national organization called UCOR, National Coalition of Social Justice Caucuses, in the Teachers Union is sponsoring in LA a conference at which activists from these locals will be invited to help strategize further some of these problems. A second problem with the alliance has been it's top down. I mean, it's just been local presidents for the most part being there. And what does that mean? Well, if you have great local presidents who are pushing militant, organized, democratic contract campaigns, that's great. But as I described, we don't have that in a number of cases. How do we get that? What we're trying to do to help with that is we're organizing a conference in July where the broader swath of community organizations, because they haven't been at the table either, as well as local activists, bargaining team members, organizing activists, that they're going to be at the table as well, and we'll see where the decision-making process goes from there. And finally, I'll finish up with this, there is a challenge of how to relate to the CTA and the CFT. While the Alliance is independent of them, and we can push the CTA to a certain extent, because they have been willing to support legislation they haven't before, but given their history of, I hate to use the word selling out, it's so old school, but given their history of like backing off of even when they were trying to do good things, like progressive taxation at one point, back in the early 2000s, we're concerned that they could do that as well. And we have to keep up the pressure on them through the state council of the CTA and through to the extent we can through their board of directors to keep those bills alive and to keep pushing them. Our ability to make any of this happen is going to depend on how well we organize at the base, and that's a question mark at this point, but it's an exciting opportunity, I think, for us.
Thanks to all the presenters who were able to talk about the different challenges and kind of fights and strategies and think through how we can bring in strike and building for strikes in our campaigns, in our contract campaigns. So now I just want to kind of open up the floor. I propose that we have, in order to try to get as many people participating as possible, maybe 2 minutes per person. Does that sound good with everybody? Yes? Okay. Good. Okay, so we'll have 2 minutes. I'll keep stack. You can pose questions. You can talk about what's going on in your own locals. And yeah, so we'll start. Kristen? Okay. And you can just raise your hand if you want to be added to the discussion.
Start talking now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to address my comments and concerns and questions to Joel because I'm one of the unions that is supposedly signed on to this state initiative. However, the state initiative wasn't passed by our 1,600 members through our representative council. As a matter of fact, it was passed in the closed session by our executive board. So I really wish they would take our name off of their flyer. It's very disturbing. Like he said, it's not a bottom-up strategy, it's a top-down strategy. And the jury's still out if it has membership support. They might be able to ram it through the rep council. That's only because they haven't educated, our local has not educated members about our own resolution, which was much more progressive on charter schools. We passed a resolution which was essentially calling on an effective moratorium to stop the expansion of charter schools. We didn't distinguish between under-regulated and regulated, private versus public, for-profit versus not-for-profit. We're not talking about making them more transparent or making them regulated the way their platform does. We took a clear principled stance against charter schools. So we took that stance. What happened to our resolution? It was repressed. You couldn't find it anywhere. The members weren't made aware of it. A substitute resolution was actually put on the website instead, so it was actually what do you call it, propaganda, reactionary propaganda. And instead what happens, our executive board behind closed doors signs on to the California Alliance. So I really have a problem with this. I think it's not helpful. It could be benign, but it's probably not benign. And I just think it's a big sham, and I do not recommend supporting this plan at all. I think it's horrible. If I had a salami sandwich, I would throw it at you. But not out of anger or anything like
Thank
that.
God you're
That's all I have
through
to
with
say.
lunch.
And it was vegetarian.
Okay. All right. Sorry. what's your name?
Carolyn.
Carolyn.
I just wanted to pose a question, and perhaps to get, I'm obviously from Australia, I've worked in the Australian Union movement, and I'm keen to understand how working at, or members of US unions deal with this. One of the challenges that we have in Australia when we formulate a democratic bargaining campaign with escalation actions, and then the first thing that happens is we have a hostile employer or an employer that either wastes time and fatigues the union membership because of time wasting, or they put a whole heap of serious cuts on the table, which means we have to go from progressive active bargaining for our campaign and realign our plan to deal with all of the various threats that we've now having to deal with. So my question, and perhaps it's useful for other people in the room, is how do you deal with that when you have to be forced to deal with cuts that are distractions or time wasting that fatigues your membership, which can impact how your strike and your plan progresses? That was a question. I'm happy for anyone to kind of take it. But.
So if people also want to think about that and maybe think of some responses as well. Yeah, your name?
Oh, Carla.
Carla? Okay, good. And then I saw Steve.
Okay, yeah, my question's for Anne. You mentioned that you thought 84% turnout, but they wouldn't say how many voted, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that. And then also later on you mentioned, just as far as like, who would say how many people voted and how can they not say? And then later you mentioned something about they lied about something to get it passed. And if you could elaborate on that as well.
Could you repeat the last part again?
Oh, you said something about, you said they lied about it to get it passed.
Yes, I would be glad to. Okay, so
just for to keep stack, what we'll do is Steve will go, and then we'll let you, and I think also Joel, you can respond since you were both kind of and then you first, and then yes. So Steve, you're up.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things on charters is there was a repeal initiative to repeal charters in California last year. And as I understand it, Joel opposed that and attacked people who were supporting it in the union. And I think the other question is the top-down approach that we're going to decide what the program is to unite teachers in California is a dangerous one. There needs to be a discussion in the locals, which there hasn't been, particularly in UTR, where the president is in favor of charters, good charters. So I think there's a systemic problem of presenting an agenda for statewide action of all teachers, which I'm in favor of, and we need of all teachers, without really having a discussion in the rank and file. And that's combined with the fact that, and this is the political problem which has not really been addressed, is that the CTA, NEA, and AFT leadership, CFT, support charters. They've accepted that you have to accept charters and let's make them better. That's their political position. So in my view, how can you really fight charters and privatization if you've accepted the premise that you have a right to have public money going to privately run charters? It makes it very difficult, and it confused a lot of teachers, which is what we learned in the repeal campaign. A lot of teachers are confused about what charters are because they're being told, well, they're good charters, or we're spending a lot of money to unionize the charters that exist, which is creating a two-tier system in California of the public school teacher who has a better contract than a charter school teacher, which is a substandard contract, and these charters also do not pay into the teacher pension fund, CalSTRS. So they're actually undermining the state teacher pension fund, because not only do they not pay for teachers' pension in the system, but also there are no unionized staff, service staff of these charters. So these are serious issues which are not being confronted really in CTA or the CFT.
Okay. Anne?
So, you know, I was running out of time when I got to that point, so I went through it too quickly. But what they did say was that 84% of the membership did vote on whether to go out on strike or not. Now, what I meant to say more clearly was in the past, they haven't told us how many people voted. But it was only this time that they did tell us what percentage of the membership voted. And of the 84% who did vote, I think it was over 90% said we want to strike. Okay, so that was that. But every time this has happened in the past, I say, what percentage of the membership voted? And they say, we don't give out that information.
The people who work for the union.
The leadership of the union, yes, thank you. And then with respect to, I also said that they lied when it came to presenting the tentative agreement to the membership, and they told two lies. See, we asked for a 5% raise during the first year of the contract we were negotiating. Well, what they did was they accepted a 5% raise at the end of the first year. And then they came in and told us, we got what we asked for. Well, there's a big difference between 5% raise at the beginning of the year and 5% raise at the end of the year, because there's been 2% inflation between the beginning and the end. So the 5% at the end of the year really amounts to a 3% raise. But they didn't say that. Okay, so that was lie number. They say, we got what we asked for. That was wrong. The second thing was, and this was really disgusting, is they said, if you don't vote in favor of this tentative agreement, you must go on strike. Well, back in the 90s, we were fighting off merit pay. And I was on a campaign, many were with me, where we campaigned against accepting a contract with merit pay. We succeeded in getting it voted down on just about all the 23 campuses. And they went to that, and we did vote down the tentative agreement, and that simply forced them back to the negotiating table, and we got rid of merit pay. So there was, the second lie was, if we didn't vote yes on this tentative agreement, we had to strike. No, the other alternative is they can go back to the negotiating table, and we can get more that way. So it was, those were the two misrepresentations.
Okay, so I have, let's see, I saw you, one person, give some time to Joel to respond as well, and then Garrett had a response to Carolyn's question. Okay.
Well, could I ask if Joel, because I have some other, I'm a member of the executive board of UESF, and I have some different kind of questions. So maybe could you address these questions first, and then I'd like to come back and ask kind of a different set.
Okay, did you in the back also have, you have a separate question, or?
It's about Joel.
Okay, there's a lot of questions for Joel. Okay, you want to, yeah.
Okay, sure. The alliance, I find it so offensive that you're tacitly approving of what's going on with taxpayer dollars, and we can't allow that. I spoke with Eric Bauer, who was running the Massachusetts campaign to limit the number of charter schools that they had each year. Even with that, within 20 years, there will not be any more public schools left. There won't be any more unions left. That's down the line. And the children of color who are being educated now in the public schools that are crumbling because of the $3 billion that's being leached out all the time, and more, it will be more and more, won't become voters. And that's what this is about. We want white majority to stay as the voters, so that, and then all of the issues are gone to hell in the handbasket, right? Global warming, we're not going to teach that in charter schools. We're going to pray to Jesus Christ our Savior, because we can, and oversight doesn't do it, because these are friends of friends of friends that run these schools. So limiting them, there's no way. We have to stop it. It's going to bleed out, and the children are not getting educated. I agree with Kristen.
Why don't we hear your question as well, and we can give a few extra minutes to you, and then we can get your response to Carolyn's question. Does that sound good?
Okay, well, okay. So as a member of the executive board of UESF, I was approached actually about the alliance. It's interesting to hear it's trying to be independent of CFT, because the first time I was formally approached around it was with my president and a member of CFT talking about the alliance and saying, well, what do you think this thing should sound like? So that's why it's kind of interesting to hear that it's, I'm not saying it's not independent, but it's strange to hear about it.
You're saying the alliance, you heard about it where?
Well, I heard about it from my president, and then later my president and a member of CFT was the one kind of talking to me about what they would want.
The same alliance?
Well, maybe it wasn't clear. That's true.
There is a CFT alliance.
Yeah. So maybe that's what that was. I will just say it's been confusing to understand. Like what I understand what this body was ultimately about was saying we do see we're linked up in terms of end of our contract dates. What can we do in common? I think what I anticipated hearing was what are some of the common contractual demands that we might have? Class size, how do we deal with the inclusion model, paraprofessionals and their low pay and the kinds of work conditions they face. So just identify some key common areas that this is what I expected to kind of hear in terms of, and then to say, these are demands that we are commonly making to all our respective districts, and this is the strike date we're setting to all go out if we don't see. Now, I would have thought it would be in August, but if it's February 2018, which to me seems late, but it's just a common date. And now what I hear is sort of like, well, we're going to leave it up to your locals. Well, here what I think is some of the problems is because I know that CFT, CTA, and AFT have their hands deep into our bargaining team and our president and our vice president. So they're largely determining the strategy that our locals are having. So if you try to be independent of them, they're going to basically scuttle anything that puts pressure on them except to reach an agreement. So
totally get you.
Right. So I'm both saying I understand your problem, but I also want to hold you accountable to that problem, because I think the only way you could have end run that is to basically hold each other, not to, you all get to locally organize. You'd have to hold each other to demand and to a strike date that you were going to commonly set. And basically commit to doing that and tell your membership this is the date we're setting. So we all better get ready for this date. So that's kind of what I anticipated. If you knew you were fighting that body, the only way you're going to, CFT and CTA, the only way you're going to do it is for all of you to commit to a date and do it, and then force the rest of the state to come with you, because so that's why I'm not sure what you were thinking, because you knew they were going to come in and basically be in the heads of all our president and vice president, because they get to talk to them every day, because they hire people to do that.
Okay, so what I'm going to suggest, because we are running out of time right now, Joel, I'll give you a couple extra minutes to respond to some of the questions here. Garrett, I know there was a question still out, so you can have a couple minutes to respond, and then we'll make some moves, because it's at 3 o'clock is when we're going to be going into the proposal planning. Okay, so Joel.
Okay, so Kristen raised the issue of what's gone down in UTR, and I kind of agree with you. I mean, I think that if the president handled it that way, it was wrong. Shouldn't have been handled that way. It should have been brought to the, is it your rep council? Mm-hmm. It should have been brought there. I don't know if it's still being planned to be, it's still going to be brought there, but I think, what is he, 26 years old? I mean, he's like an inexperienced guy, and he comes out of a sort of a questionable past. So I totally get your point here. That doesn't mean I think that the project is statewide is wrong. It's just that the way in which it was implemented in that local sounds like it was mistaken, and hopefully something better can come out of it there. I hope so. The second is there's more political issues raised here than that I think Steve raises, and I don't know your name. Lena raised, and that's the question of whether you how you try to reform charter schools, or whether you do it all, or you just go after stopping them, like, for instance, that statewide repeal thing that Steve talked about, which I did oppose, and I'll tell you why. In order to take on the charter school industry, you have to have an organized base, and there has to be a base of organizing for you to stop them. And that initiative was done not with that in mind. And my view was it would have gone down to terrible defeat, and it would have been a setback for the movement to stop charter schools, number one. Number two, I think, I'm a socialist. I believe that we have wage slavery. Does that mean I'm against higher wages? I'm for those reforms, even though I'm against the concept of wages. We have to fight for reforms that will strengthen people's resolve to fight. That's what we're about. That's what organizers do. And we can't start with the end point. We have to start with where people are willing to be organized around what they see as reasonable, what they can fight for, and then to move the relationship of forces accordingly. And so I don't think that you can start out with ending it. I'm sorry, it's just not the way organizing works. If we're involved in organizing, we have to start with public control over public funds. And that means accountability for charter schools. Now that means, even the motion in Richmond, which was not to get rid of charter schools, it was to stop it was to call a moratorium on them. In fact, it didn't even call for ending them. It said a moratorium, a moratorium could be for a year, and then you could start up again. Yeah. So, that I'm just saying that what that motion assumed was what I'm talking about, is you can't start at the end point. You got to get there. And the question is how to get there, it seems to me, is to fight for public control over that. So, for instance, take the demand for local control over authorization. That now makes it possible for boards to turn them down, much more so than they did before. That is a reform worth fighting for. Of a moratorium reform, which by the way is in the hopper in Sacramento. That's worth fighting for. And I think that's not different from what the Richmond resolution says. So there's that. Okay, and I think that's an important strategic discussion to have, is how you go about making change. The last thing I wanted to say is about what's your name?
Andy. Andy Lipson.
Andy, yeah, Andy. My view, I've been working a bit with UESF folks for the last, since I moved up here, and with the EDU folks. Some of the EDU, or formerly EDU folks, since it seems to be not in great shape. And it seems to me that what has to happen there, I agree with you, that in that local, especially in that local, the executive, it isn't just the CTA and CFT, it's the executive board majority, which I know you're on it, you would know that better than me, is dead set on basically settling a contract. And we want a contract and we want it now. That was a big chant at the demonstration in San Francisco. No, we don't want it now. We want to build up so that you can you possibly go on strike for something better and something coordinated. So I think that the organizing at the base, at the rep council level, the rep assembly level, or your assembly level, to get around your executive board, to place specific contract demands, which I understand you don't even have a salary demand. That's amazing to me, not to go into negotiations about salary demand.
Joel, can you start wrapping up?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So what I'm saying is, I think that what has to be done in San Francisco is an end around, and it has to be from the bottom up. There's no other way to do it. There's no other way to stop the CTA and CFT influence. But it's, from what I gather, it's the executive board majority that's really the problem there.
Okay, all right, so Garrett and then David Eifler wanted to join, and then we're gonna break. And just to say that this is an ongoing, we're not gonna solve all the problems in this one workshop, right? There's gonna be a lot of opportunities to think through how we can build and move forward beyond this. Okay, so Garrett, go ahead.
I just want to respond to the question about how to deal with concessionary proposals that management proposes, and how to deal with management dragging out bargaining. So I mean, for the concessionary proposals part, I think, one approach, which is the kind of more conservative, bureaucratic approach, I think is, you have closed door bargaining, like Ann was talking about, where, maybe management proposes a 4% takeaway in wages, and the only membership update that the members get is, we passed a proposal and management passed a counter proposal, right? And that is bad on any number of levels, but I think it's particularly bad because members would be very pissed off to know that management is proposing a 4% takeaway. So I think that's all the more reason why it's really important to have an open democratic bargaining process. And if management does propose concessions, to take those word-for-word proposals to all the members, department by department, and show them to the members and say, this is what management thinks of your work. They think it's worth this. They think that that you shouldn't have rights, and this is why we have to mobilize and prepare to strike. So I think that's why, linking up kind of what we've been talking about in terms of having a democratic bargaining process and building for a strike democratically, I think it's super important when it comes to concessions. The second point about how to deal with management dragging out bargaining, I think someone alluded to this earlier, but I think this is a point to which it's really important to have a strike deadline. And to set your strike deadline at a moment of peak power, right? Don't set your strike, for us as a graduate student union, we wouldn't want to set our strike deadline over the summer when none of us are around, right? That would be a failure of a strike. So thinking very carefully about when is your moment of peak power, and setting that deadline so that management can't drag it out so that they try to get you to make concessions in the summer.
Thank you. All right, we'll have our last comment, and we'll head on to the next.
Yeah, I want to say I'm sorry for coming in late. I just came from the melee downtown between the out-of-town fascists and the out-of-town Black Bloc group. They didn't seem to have much in common, except everybody had way too many tattoos. The other thing that they didn't have in common was the ability to articulate a vision for the future. And there was a lot of hatred back and forth, and you'll see it on the news tonight. But I wanted to say, I think the real work, and the reason I came back, that's happening in society now is happening here at this conference, in this room, among these discussions. And I hope that when our union goes into strategizing about contract negotiations, we're able to articulate a vision of what the future looks like, not for ourselves only, and I've heard it here many times, but for our kids, our parents, our communities, and what society is going to look like, because I think that's what people are looking for. We're union membership in this country, what, 10, 11%? We've got to grow that. And the only way we're going to grow that is by articulating a vision and kind of moving beyond some of the traditional fights that we've been having around wages. Very important, we have to have those, but if we can't articulate a larger vision for the larger society, I think we're going to lose. And based on what I saw a few minutes ago, time is running out. Neoliberalism is dying, and it's dying a bloody death, and we better be there to articulate a vision of what's going to replace it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your participation, for being here. By the way, David was part of the organizing committee and one of the librarians that I talked about the librarian campaign at Berkeley. So I'm glad you were able to be here. Anyway, so thank you so much again. And so please head upstairs where we're going to have the proposals and deliberation in room 155. And yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.